In London's most exclusive social circles, a successful man was about to lose everything he thought mattered. What started as a celebration of love took a devastating turn when his own fiancée chose another man, his brother, in front of 200 witnesses? Julian Carter wasn't your typical victim of betrayal. For 32 years, he had built his life on loyalty, duty, and quiet strength, known for his unwavering integrity and emotional restraint. When he found himself publicly humiliated at his own engagement party, he had no idea he was about to discover what real love actually felt like. Julian's retreat to the hotel garden that night would lead to a connection that would shock London's society to its core. What began as shared disappointment between two wounded souls would become the most scandalous and genuine romance the city had seen in decades. The Bellamy and Carter families would never be the same after. Julian chose the one woman he was never supposed to want, his ex-fiancée's mother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The champagne flutes caught the light from the crystal chandeliers at the Savoys. River room like tiny golden mirrors reflecting everything I thought I knew about my life back at me, and I stood there in my perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit watching 200 of London's most influential people mill about celebrating what was supposed to be the beginning of my future with Naomi, but something felt wrong from the moment. We walked in, something in the way she kept glancing toward the entrance, something in the way her fingers drummed against her clutch when she thought I wasn't looking, something in the way she barely touched the champagne I'd selected specifically because it was her favorite vintage, the same one we'd shared the night I proposed 6 months ago, in the garden of her father's estate, when she said yes, with tears in her eyes, and I believed completely that we were meant for each other, that our families, expectations, and our own quiet affection would bloom into something lasting, something real. I had spent weeks planning this engagement party. Down to the smallest detail, the orchids were Naomi's favorite. The menu featured all the dishes from our first proper date. Even the string quartet was playing the same piece that had been drifting through the restaurant the night she first told me she could see a future with me, and as I watched her move through the crowd in that stunning midnight blue Valentino gown, her dark hair swept up to show off the antique diamond earrings my grandmother had left me to give to my future wife, I felt a strange mixture of pride and uneased pride, because she was beautiful and accomplished, and everyone could see that I had somehow managed to win her. And unease because something in her smile didn't quite reach her eyes the way it used to. When she looked at me, Mother had outdone herself with the guest list. Every name that mattered in London society was here, from MPs to media moguls to old money. Families whose titles stretched back centuries, and they were all here to witness Julian Carter finally doing something worthy of the family name, something that would elevate our construction empire beyond mere business success into the realm of true social prominence. And I could see Mother across the room in her steel gray Chanel, holding court with a group of other society matrons, no doubt already planning the wedding guest list and calculating the social capital this union would bring to our family name. The speeches were scheduled to begin at 9, and as the hour approached, I found myself standing at the front of the room, looking out at all those expectant faces, feeling oddly detached from my own life, as if I were watching someone else's engagement party, someone else's future being sealed with champagne, toasts, and polite applause. When the room fell quiet and all eyes turned to me, I cleared my throat and began the speech I had written and rewritten a dozen times, trying to capture something true about love and commitment and the strange alchemy that turns two separate lives into something shared love. I heard myself saying, into the sudden silence is not just passion or romance or the butterflies we feel when someone special walks into a room. Love is the choice to see someone completely, to know their flaws and fears, and still choose them. Every single day, love is loyalty and trust, and the faith that when the world becomes uncertain, the person standing beside you will remain constant, will remain true. And as I spoke these words, looking directly at Naomi, standing there in all her beauty, I realized with a cold certainty that I was describing something I hoped for rather than something I actually had. Something I believed love should be rather than what ours actually was. But then something shifted in the room, a murmur starting somewhere near the back, and spreading forward like ripples in still water, and I saw Naomi's face change, saw her eyes widen and fix on something behind me, and when I turned around, there was my brother Eli leaning against the doorframe in his characteristic pose of studied casual elegance, his dark hair tousled, just so his expensive clothes worn with the careless confidence of someone who had never doubted his own appeal, and I felt my stomach drop because I knew that look. I had seen it countless times throughout our childhood. Whenever Eli wanted something that belonged to me, Eli pushed off from the doorframe and walked into the room, and the energy changed completely, suddenly crackling with tension and anticipation, and I watched as Naomi's the entire body seemed to orient toward him like a flower turning toward the sun, and in that moment, I understood with devastating clarity that everything I thought I knew about my relationship with Naomi had been built on willful blindness and careful self-deception, that whatever she felt for me, it was nothing compared to what she felt for him actually. Naomi's voice cut through the silence, and she stepped forward away from me toward Eli, and her voice was stronger and more certain than I had heard it in months. "There's something. I need to say something I should have said a long time ago," and she reached out and took Eli's hand right there in front of everyone, and I watched my brother's fingers close around hers with the easy familiarity of something that had been happening for much longer than tonight. She said, and her voice carried clearly through the room, reaching every corner, every shocked face, "I'm sorry for doing this here like this, but I can't pretend anymore. I can't marry someone when my heart belongs to someone else." And Eli stepped closer to her, and I saw him smile, that lazy, confident smile that had always made people forgive him for things they would never forgive anyone else. The room erupted into gasps and whispers, and I could hear Mother's sharp intake of breath and see Richard Bellamy's face turning red with embarrassment and fury, but all I could focus on was the way Naomi looked at Eli. The way she had never once looked at me, with complete adoration, with desperate hunger, with the kind of love that burns everything else away, and I realized that I had been a placeholder, a safe choice, a backup plan, while she waited for the man she really wanted to decide he wanted her back. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, watching my carefully constructed life crumble in front of 200 witnesses, and then I did the only thing I could do. I walked away quietly and calmly with what little dignity I had left, and left them all to their scandal and their whispers and their shocked speculation about what would happen next. The Savoy's terrace garden was mercifully empty, the October air sharp enough to keep the guests inside, but I needed the cold. I needed something to cut through the strange numbness that had settled over me like a heavy blanket, muffling all sensation, all thought, and I stood there looking out over the Thames, watching the lights from the South Bank blur and shimmer through what I was horrified to realize might be tears, though I couldn't remember the last time I had cried, couldn't remember allowing myself that particular weakness. I had loosened my tie and unbuttoned my collar and was contemplating whether I should just leave entirely, just call my driver and disappear into the London night, when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me, measured, elegant steps that somehow managed to convey both purpose and hesitation, and when I turned, I was surprised to see Evelyn Bellamy walking toward me, her wrap pulled tight against the evening chill, her face composed, but her eyes showing something I couldn't quite identify. "I thought I might find you out here," she said, and her voice was lower than usual, touched with something that might have been sympathy or might have been her own carefully controlled emotion, and she came to stand beside me at the stone balustrade, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive that suited her perfectly. I wanted to apologize for my daughter's behavior, though I suspect my apologies mean very little at this particular moment. I looked at her properly, then really looked at her, and realized that I had never noticed before how beautiful she was in a way that was completely different from Naomi's youth and vibrancy. Evelyn's beauty was refined, distilled, seasoned by experience, and loss, in the kind of wisdom that comes from having lived through more than one heartbreak. And as I met her gaze, I saw something there that surprised me, a recognition, a shared understanding of what it felt like to be disappointed by the people you trusted most. "You don't need to apologize for her," I said, and my voice sounded strange and rough to my own ears. "She's not responsible for her choices, and neither are you, though. I have to admit I didn't see this coming. I thought I knew her better than that. thought I understood what we had together. And even as I said the words, I realized how naive they sounded, how willfully blind I had been to signs that were probably obvious to everyone else. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with those sharp, intelligent eyes that missed. Nothing, and then she said something that surprised me. "I think you did know her. Julian perhaps better than she knows herself, which is why this is so painful. You knew she was capable of this kind of impulse, this kind of selfishness, and you loved her anyway. But that doesn't make it hurt less, does it? Knowing that someone you love is flawed doesn't prepare you for the moment. When those flaws destroy everything you've built together." There was something in her voice that made me think she was speaking from experience, and I found myself asking, "Is that what happened with you and Richard?" And immediately regretted the question, because it was too personal, too presumptuous. But instead of pulling away or changing the subject, she smiled sadly and nodded something like that, though in our case it was less dramatic and more gradual, just a slow erosion of whatever we had in the beginning until we became strangers, sharing a house and a name and a daughter who inherited all of my romantic idealism and none of my hard-earned pragmatism, she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, just a kind of weary acceptance that made my chest tighten with sympathy. We stood there in comfortable silence for a while, watching the river flow past, carrying lights and shadows, and the detritus of the city toward the sea, and I found myself thinking about the strange turns life takes, the way everything can change in a single moment and leave you standing in a place you never expected to be with people you never thought you'd understand, and somehow the presence of this elegant woman beside me made the whole catastrophic evening feel less like the end of the world and more like the end of one chapter in a story I was still writing, Evelyn said eventually, and there was something almost conspiratorial in her voice. "I always thought you were too good for her, too. It's thoughtful to genuine for someone who thrives on drama and uncertainty. But then I thought perhaps I was just being an overprotective mother who couldn't see her daughter's happiness clearly enough to understand what she needed, and she turned to look at me directly, but watching what just happened in there. I think I was right the first time her words hit me with unexpected force, not because they were particularly comforting, but because they suggested that someone had been paying attention. Someone had seen me clearly enough to recognize something worthwhile, and that someone was this woman, who barely knew me, but who seemed to understand something about loneliness and disappointment that my own family had never grasped, and I felt something shift inside me, some small crack in the wall I had built around my emotions. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than I had meant anything in a very long time for seeing that, for saying it. I've been wondering lately if there was something wrong with me, something that made me fundamentally unable to inspire the kind of passion that makes people throw their lives away for love. And maybe there is. Maybe I'm just not built for grand gestures and dramatic declarations, but I thought what Naomi and I had was enough. I thought quiet love could be just as real as the burning. Kind Evelyn reached out then and touched my hand briefly, just her fingertips against my knuckles, but the contact sent shock through me that had nothing to do with the cold air and everything to do with the sudden realization that this woman, this brilliant, complicated woman, was looking at me with something that might have been respect or admiration or something else entirely. Something I was afraid to name. Quiet love is the only kind that lasts, she said softly, the only kind that survives disappointment and compromise and the slow accumulation of daily life. But you're young, still young enough to find someone who appreciates that kind of devotion instead of someone who takes it for granted. And then she withdrew her hand and stepped back, and I felt the loss of her touch like a physical ache. We heard voices from inside growing louder and more agitated, and Evelyn glanced back toward the party with an expression of distaste and resignation. I should go back in, deal with the aftermath, try to minimize the damage to both our families' reputations, though. "I suspect this will be tomorrow's headlines, regardless of what any of us do now," she said, and I nodded, understanding that this moment, whatever it had been, was ending. But as she turned to go, she paused and looked back at me and said, "Julian, if you ever need to talk to someone who understands what it's like to be disappointed by people you trusted, I hope you'll remember that you're not alone in this." And then she was gone, leaving me standing there in the cold London air with the strange sense that something important had just happened, something that had nothing to do with Naomi or Eli or the wreckage. of my engagement and everything to do with the unexpected grace of finding understanding in the most unlikely place. The next morning brought the inevitable storm of phone calls and text messages and carefully worded expressions of sympathy that somehow managed to feel more like accusations, and I sat in my kitchen in my Belgravia flat, staring at my phone as it buzzed incessantly on the marble countertop, each notification another reminder that my private humiliation had become public. Entertainment for people who claimed to care about me but seemed far more interested in the scandal than in my actual well-being. Mother arrived at 10 o'clock sharp because of course she did, still dressed in her armor of perfectly applied makeup. In designer clothes, as if she could force the world back into proper order through sheer force of will and presentation, and she swept into my flat without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors like gunshots. In the silence, "Julian, we need to discuss how we're going to handle this situation," she announced before she had even removed her coat, and I could see the tension in every line of her body, the carefully controlled fury of someone whose plans had been disrupted by other people's inconvenient emotions. The phones had been ringing. All morning, reporters calling for statement society, columnists wanting quotes, and I've had 2 field calls from 3 different board members asking about the impact on our business. Relationships. I poured myself another cup of coffee and didn't offer her one because I knew she would decline it anyway, coffee being too casual, too human for someone who was operating in full crisis management mode, and I said, as calmly as I could manage, "What exactly do you want me to say, Mother? That I'm devastated, that I'm humiliated, that I never saw it coming, because all of those things are true.
Oh, but I
Don't think they're what you want to hear." She stood there in my kitchen looking around at the breakfast dishes I hadn't bothered to clear, and the newspaper I hadn't been able to bring myself to read, and I could see her calculating the damage to our family's reputation, the potential business ramifications, the social consequences of having raised a son who couldn't keep his fiancée interested enough to go through with the wedding, and her expression hardened into something I recognized from childhood. The look she got when one of us had disappointed her beyond her ability to forgive easily. "What I want," she said in that crisp, precise tone that had terrified me and Eli throughout our youth, "is for you to stop wallowing in self-pity and start thinking about how to salvage the situation we have spent decades building our position in this city, and I will not watch it crumble because you couldn't hold on to a girl who was clearly never worthy of our family in the first place." The casual dismissal of Naomi stung more than I expected it to, not because I was still harboring romantic feelings for her, but because it revealed something about Mother's character that I had always suspected, but never wanted to acknowledge, that her love and approval were conditional on success, on maintaining the family image, on never being vulnerable enough to fail publicly and spectacularly, and I felt something inside me harden against her before I could respond. My phone rang, and Eli's name appeared on the screen, and Mother and I both stared at it for a moment before I declined the call without answering, and she looked at me with something that might have been approval, if it hadn't been so coldly calculating good. She said, "We need to present a united front, ignore his attempts to explain or apologize, and focus on moving forward with dignity and grace. The Bellamys are dealing with their own crisis, and if we handle this correctly, we can emerge from this a situation with our reputation intact and possibly even enhanced by comparison to their daughter's shocking behavior." I wanted to point out that Eli was her son too, that his behavior was just as shocking as Naomi's and far more personal in its betrayal, but I knew it would be pointless. Mother had always made excuses for Eli's behavior, had always found ways to reframe selfishness as charm, his cruelty as confidence, and this situation would be no different. He would be forgiven eventually. While I would be expected to carry the burden of the family's embarrassment, the doorbell rang and Mother tensed as if expecting reporters or photographers, but when I opened the door it was Lena standing there with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery and an expression of fierce protectiveness that made my throat tighten with gratitude. "I brought breakfast and moral support," she said, pushing past me into the flat and nodding politely too. Mother, who was clearly displeased by this interruption to our crisis management session, "and I wanted to make sure you were eating because I know you, and I know you probably haven't had a proper meal since last night." Lena had been my closest friend since university, the one person who had never seemed impressed by my family's money or status, who had seen through my carefully constructed exterior to whatever was genuine underneath, and who had remained loyal even when I had been too caught up in my relationship with Naomi to be a very good friend in return in having her here. Now felt like a lifeline. Mother clearly wanted Lena to leave, wanted to continue our conversation about damage control and public relations strategy, but Lena settled herself at my kitchen island and began unpacking the pastries with the determined air of someone who had no intention of being dismissed, and I felt a small spark of defiance kindle in my chest. Actually, Mother, I think we're done here for now, I said, and saw her eyebrows rise in surprise because I had never cut short one of her lectures before, had never prioritized anyone else's company over her demands for attention and discussion. I need some time to process what happened and to figure out what I want to do next, and I can't do that while you're trying to manage my response to the situation. She gathered her coat and purse with sharp, efficient movements and paused at the door to deliver what I knew would be her parting shot. Julian, I hope you'll remember that some mistakes can be recovered from and some cannot, and the difference often lies in how quickly and decisively one acts to minimize the damage. And then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and the echo of barely concealed disappointment. Lena waited until she heard the front door close before she spoke, and then she turned to me with an expression of concern mixed with something that might have been anger on my behalf. How are you really doing, Julian? Not the version you put on for your mother, but the actual truth about how you're feeling right now, and something about the way she asked the question. The genuine care in her voice, the absence of any agenda beyond wanting to understand, broke through the careful control I had been maintaining since last night, and I found myself telling her everything. It's not just about the humiliation and the betrayal, but about the strange conversation with Evelyn Bellamy, the garden, about the way she had looked at me as if she saw something worthwhile, about the unexpected comfort I had found in her presence. Lena listened without interrupting until I finished, and then she was quiet for a long moment before she said, You know, it's interesting that the person who offered you the most genuine comfort last night was someone who barely knows you while your own family is more concerned with managing the optics than with your actual emotional well-being. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message, and when I glanced at the screen, my heart did something strange and fluttery because it was from Evelyn Bellamy. And all it said was T, my place. No talk of her, just silence. And I stared at the message for a long moment before showing it to Lena, who read it and smiled well. She said, That's either the beginning of something very interesting or the beginning of something very complicated. And knowing you, it's probably both. But either way, I think you should go, because the worst that can happen is you spend an afternoon drinking tea with an intelligent woman who understands what you're going through. And the best that can happen is she paused and grinned. Well, we'll just have to wait and see, won't we, Evelyn's? Flat in? Mayfair was nothing like what I had expected. Somehow I had imagined something grand and imposing like the Bellamy family estate, but instead, I found myself standing in a space that was elegant but intimate, filled with books and art and the kind of personal touches that spoke of a woman who had chosen each piece carefully, not for its status or value, but because it meant something to her. And as she led me through the sitting room, I noticed photographs tucked between the expensive vases, images of Naomi as a child, but also landscapes and street scenes that suggested someone who saw beauty in unexpected places. She had changed from the formal dress she wore to the engagement party into a cream cashmere sweater and dark trousers that somehow made her look younger, less armored, and as she moved around the kitchen preparing tea, I watched the graceful economy of her movements, the way she handled the delicate china with practiced ease, and I found myself wondering about her life, the parts of it that had nothing to do with being Richard Bellamy's wife, or Naomi's mother, the woman she was when no one was watching. I wasn't sure you would come, she said as she arranged biscuits on a plate, and her voice carried a note of uncertainty that surprised me because everything about Evelyn Bellamy suggested someone who was always sure of herself, always in control of every situation. I thought perhaps it was too soon or too inappropriate, or that you might prefer to suffer through this alone, the way most men seem to prefer to handle their pain. I accepted the cup she offered me, and our fingers brushed for just a moment as I took it. And I felt that same electric shock I had experienced in the garden, but stronger this time, more impossible to ignore, and when I looked up to meet her eyes, I saw that she had felt it too, though she covered it quickly with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I've never been very good at suffering alone, I admitted, and settled into the armchair across from her, despite what my family might prefer. I think I need to talk about what happened to try to understand it, instead of just pushing it down and pretending it doesn't matter. But most people don't really want to hear about it. They want me to move on quickly and quietly so everyone can stop being uncomfortable. Evelyn curled up in the corner of her sofa with her tea cradled in both hands and studied me with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything, and she said, I think people are uncomfortable with genuine emotion, with the mess and complication of real feelings. They prefer everything to be neat and tidy and resolved quickly so they don't have to examine their own lives too closely, or wonder whether they're as secure as they think they are. There was something in her voice that made me think she was speaking from experience, and I found myself asking, is that what happened when you and Richard separated? Did people want you to pretend it was all very civilized and amicable, instead of admitting that it was painful and messy? It took years to work through. She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her teacup as if it held answers to questions she had been asking herself for years, and then she said, Richard and I never actually separated. We just stopped living in the same emotional space, stopped seeing each other as anything more than business partners in the enterprise of raising Naomi and maintaining our social position. And yes, everyone preferred to pretend that was perfectly normal, perfectly healthy, because the alternative was admitting that most marriages in our circle are built on convenience rather than love. The honesty of her answer surprised me, and I felt something shift between us, some barrier coming down as she continued. I married Richard because he was suitable, because our families approved, because I was 22 and thought that was what love was supposed to look like, stable and respectable and predictable. And by the time I realized that I had confused security with affection, it was too late. Naomi was born, and I was trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty. From within, I set down my teacup and leaned forward, drawn by the raw honesty in her voice, and said, I think I understand that feeling of being trapped by other people's expectations, by the life you're supposed to want even when it doesn't feel like it fits. I've spent so much time trying to be the son my parents wanted, the man Naomi thought she needed. That I'm not sure I know who I actually am underneath all of that. Evelyn looked up at me then, and her expression was soft and thoughtful, and she said, I see someone who is kind and genuine and capable of deep feeling, someone who deserves to be chosen for who he is rather than for who he might become or what he might provide, and I think that person has been there all along, waiting for someone to notice him, to value him for the right reasons. Her words hit me with unexpected force, and I felt something crack open in my chest, someplace I had kept carefully protected, and when I tried to speak, my voice came out rougher than I intended. No one has ever said anything like that to me before. No one has ever looked at me and seen anything worth choosing over someone like Eli, who is everything I'm not. Confident and magnetic and willing to take what he wants without worrying about the consequences. Eli is a child, Evelyn said with surprising firmness. It's a beautiful, charming child who has never had to develop depth or character because his surface appeal has always been enough. And Naomi is drawn to him because she's still young enough to mistake intensity for love drama, for passion, but someday she realized that what burns bright burns out quickly, and what she threw away for the sake of excitement was something much more valuable. We sat in silence for a while, and I found myself studying her face, the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and worry, and equal measure the elegant bones that would be beautiful at any age. The mouth that was softer now than it had been at the engagement party when she was performing the role of the perfect political wife, and I realized that I was attracted to her, not just physically, though I was beginning to admit that too myself, but intellectually, emotionally drawn to her wisdom and her honesty and her refusal to pretend that life was simpler than it actually was when she reached for the teapot to refill our cups. I moved to help her, and our hands met on the handle, and this time neither of us pulled away immediately, and felt the warmth of her skin through the delicate porcelain and saw her breath catch slightly, and in that moment I understood that whatever was happening between us was not just comfort or sympathy or the strange bond of shared disappointment, but something else. Entirely something that made my pulse quicken and my carefully controlled world tilt on its axis. "Julian," she said softly, and my name sounded different, and her voice warmer, more intimate. And I realized that she was going to pull away, going to remind me of who she was, who I was supposed to be, why this moment couldn't lead anywhere, and so I did something that surprised both of us. I leaned closer and let my fingers trace along her knuckles where they still held the teapot handle. "I know this is impossible," I said quietly. "I know all the reasons why we can't and shouldn't. And I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to know that sitting here with you talking like this is the first time I felt seen. Really seen by someone in longer than I can remember, and whatever that means, whatever it becomes or doesn't become, I'm grateful for it." She didn't pull away, but she didn't move closer either, and I could see the conflict in her eyes, the war between what she wanted and what she thought was appropriate. And finally she said, "Julian, you should probably go now, not because I want you to, but because if you stay much longer, I'm going to do something that will complicate both of our lives in ways we're not prepared for preparing." And narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I stood up slowly, reluctantly, and she walked me to the door, and as I was leaving, she touched my arm and said, "Thank you for coming, for trusting me with your honesty, for seeing me as more than just Naomi's mother or Richard's wife." And I wanted to tell her that I saw her as so much more than that, but the words stuck in my throat because they felt too dangerous, too loaded with possibility. As I walked away from her building, I realized that everything had changed again, that whatever I had expected from this afternoon, it wasn't the recognition that I was falling for a woman who was supposed to be off limits in every possible way, but who felt more right, more real than anything else in my carefully constructed life. 3 days later, Evelyn texted me again, just a simple message that said, "Regent's Park, the Rose Garden. Tomorrow at 3, if you'd like to walk." And I stared at the words for a long time, trying to decode what she meant by them, whether this was just two people who understood each other's loneliness, meeting for a friendly conversation, or something else entirely, something that would cross lines we weren't supposed to cross. And in the end, I decided that I didn't care about the lines anymore, because the alternative was sitting in my flat, thinking about all the ways my life had imploded and wondering if I would ever feel connected to another human being again. I arrived at the Rose Garden early because I'm always early for everything. It's one of those habits ingrained by years of trying to meet other people's expectations. And I found myself walking among the autumn roses, most of them spent now, but still beautiful in their decline. And I thought about impermanence, about how things that seem permanent can change overnight, about how sometimes the most beautiful moments come after you think everything is over. When Evelyn appeared at the garden entrance, I felt my heart do something complicated in my chest, because she looked different again. Softer than she had at the engagement party, more relaxed than she had been at her flat. And she was wearing a camel-colored coat and boots. That made her look younger, less formal. And when she smiled at me, I felt that same electric recognition that had been building between us since the night. "Everything fell apart. I wasn't sure you'd come," she said as she approached, and I realized that she was nervous, which somehow made me feel both protective and more nervous myself, because if Evelyn Bellamy was uncertain about this, whatever this was, then we were definitely venturing into uncharted territory. "I've been thinking about nothing else since I left your flat," I admitted, and saw something flicker in her eyes, something that might have been relief or pleasure or fear. "I keep telling myself all the reasons this is a bad idea, but I can't seem to convince myself to stay away from you." We started walking along the path that wound through the garden, and for a while we didn't talk, just moved in comfortable silence past the other visitors, the couples holding hands, the families with children, the solitary figures like ourselves who seemed to be seeking something they couldn't name. And I found myself thinking about how strange it was that I felt more at peace walking with this woman than had in years of being with Naomi. "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with your family, or your work, or any of the roles you play," Evelyn said suddenly, And when I looked at her, she was smiling in a way that transformed her entire face, made her look mischievous and curious, and younger than her years. I collect old maps, I said, and felt slightly ridiculous for admitting it. Not valuable ones, just interesting ones. Maps of places that don't exist anymore, or places that were drawn before people knew what they actually looked like. And I like to imagine what it would have been like to be the first person to explore those blank spaces, to fill in the unknown territories. She stopped walking and turned to look at me with genuine delight and said, "That's wonderful. I would never have guessed that about you, though. Now that you've told me, I can see it. The appeal of the unknown, the romance of discovery, the idea that there are still mysteries left in the world," and the way she said it made my hobby sound like something beautiful rather than eccentric. "What about you?" I asked. "What do you do when you're not being the perfect political wife or the concerned mother? What makes you happy in a way that has nothing to do with anyone else's expectations?" She was quiet for a moment, as if the question had surprised her, and then she said, "I paint watercolors, terrible ones, that I would never show anyone. But there's something about the way the colors bleed into each other, the way you can't completely control what happens on the paper, that appeals to me. And I have a studio in the flat that Richard doesn't know about, where I go to make my beautiful disasters." The image of her painting alone in a secret studio made something warm unfurl in my chest, and I said I'd like to see them someday. "Your beautiful disasters," and she laughed and said that might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, which tells you everything you need to know about my marriage. We had been walking for almost an hour when an elderly couple passed us going the other direction, and the woman smiled at us and said to her husband, "Look at those two. They remind me of us when we were courting so clearly in love." And both Evelyn and I froze for a moment, because the observation was so casually made, so naturally assumed that we were a couple. And when I looked at Evelyn, her cheeks were pink, but she was smiling. "We should probably clarify," I said, though I made no move to chase after the couple, tell them we're not actually together, that this is just a walk between friends. But even as I said the words, they felt false, hollow, like I was lying to myself as much as to anyone else. "Should we?" Evelyn asked, and there was something in her voice that made me stop walking entirely, because I have to admit that hearing someone assume we were together didn't feel wrong to me. It felt like something I might want to be true, even though I know all the reasons it's impossible. I turned to face her fully and saw that she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before, something open and vulnerable and hopeful, and I realized that we had crossed some invisible line that we couldn't uncross, that whatever was happening between us had moved beyond friendship or mutual comfort into something more dangerous and more real. "Evelyn," I said, and her name felt different on my tongue now, weighted with possibility and complication. "I need to tell you something. I'm attracted to you, not just intellectually or emotionally, but in every way that matters, and I know that makes this more complicated, but I can't pretend it's not true anymore." She stepped closer to me, then close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, close enough to smell her perfume, and she said, "Julian, I've been married for 25 years to a man who sees me as a useful accessory, and I have never once felt the way I feel when I'm with you, like someone is actually seeing me. It's like someone thinks I'm worth choosing, and I don't know what to do with that." I reached out then and touched her face, gently tracing the line of her cheekbone with my thumb, and she leaned into the touch and closed her eyes, and for a moment we stood there in the middle of the rose garden, surrounded by the ghosts of summer flowers and the possibility of something that shouldn't exist but felt more real than anything else in my life. When she opened her eyes again, she stepped back and wrapped her coat more tightly around herself and said, "We should go separately. I'll leave first and you wait." A few minutes, and I nodded, understanding that we had pushed as far as we could push for one afternoon. But as she turned to go, she looked back at me and said, "Julian, this isn't over. Whatever this is, we're not done with it yet." I watched her walk away and stood there among the roses until she was out of sight, and then I stayed longer, trying to process what had just happened between us, trying to understand how in the space of a few days my entire world had shifted from the safe, predictable trajectory I had been following towards something completely unknown and infinitely more complicated. And when I finally left the garden, I carried with me the memory of her face. When she said my name, the way it sounded like a prayer or a promise, or both. I had been avoiding Eli's calls for almost a week when he showed up outside my building at 7 in the morning, looking like he hadn't slept much and wearing yesterday's clothes and the kind of desperate energy that usually meant he had done something he was either very proud of or very ashamed of. And knowing my brother, it could have been either. And when he saw me coming out to get coffee, fell into step beside me without invitation, as if nothing had changed between us, as if he hadn't destroyed my engagement and humiliated me in front of everyone we knew. "Julian, we need to talk," he said, and his voice had that edge it got when he was trying to sound reasonable while actually being anything but "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I need you to understand that what happened with Naomi, it wasn't planned. It wasn't some scheme to hurt you, it just happened, and I'm sorry that you got caught in the middle of it." I kept walking toward the coffee shop on the corner, because the alternative was standing there on the pavement having this conversation, where anyone could see us, and also because I needed caffeine if I was going to deal with whatever Eli had come to say, and I could feel him watching me, trying to gauge my mood, trying to figure out which approach would be most likely to earn him the forgiveness he had always been able to extract from everyone. No matter what he had done, "You're sorry I got caught in the middle," I repeated, and my voice sounded flat, even to my own ears, as if my engagement to her was just an inconvenient obstacle to your great love story, as if the fact that she was supposed to marry me in 3 months was just bad timing rather than a betrayal of everything family is supposed to mean. Eli grabbed my arm as we reached the coffee shop and forced me to stop and look at him. And I saw something in his eyes that might have been genuine regret, though with Eli it was always hard to tell the difference between authentic emotion and performance. And he said, "Look, I know how this looks. I know it seems like I set out to steal her from you, but Julian, you have to understand, Naomi and I have history. We were together long before you started dating her, and those feelings never really went away. They just got buried under all the practical considerations about who was suitable and who made sense on paper history." I said, and felt something cold and sharp settle in my stomach. What kind of history exactly? Because as far as I knew, you barely spoke to each other during university, and Naomi never mentioned any previous relationship between you. But even as I said it, I was remembering things, small things, that suddenly made sense. The way Naomi's eyes would find at Eli at family gatherings, the way she would laugh a little too loudly at his jokes, the way she sometimes seemed distracted when we were together, as if part of her attention was always elsewhere. Eli had the grace to look uncomfortable, and he glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was listening before he said, "We had a thing the summer before you two started dating. It was brief but intense, and we both knew it couldn't go anywhere because you were already interested in her. And I didn't want to complicate things, but Julian, she never forgot about it, and neither did I. And when she called me 2 weeks ago crying about the engagement, saying she wasn't sure she could go through with it, I had to see her 2 weeks ago. I had been selecting wine for the engagement party and confirming catering details and thinking about how lucky I was to have found someone who understood my world, who would be a good partner for the life I was building. And Naomi had been calling my brother, crying about our engagement, about her uncertainty about me. And the worst part was that I wasn't even surprised, because some part of me had always known that I was her safe choice, her backup plan, the man she settled for rather than the one she chose. "So you decided to rescue her," I said, and opened the door to the coffee shop. "How noble of you to help her realize she was making a terrible mistake by marrying someone who actually loved her, someone who would have been faithful to her, someone who would have put her needs before his own ego." And I ordered my usual without looking at Eli, because I was afraid of what I might do if I saw his face. But Eli wasn't finished. He followed me to the counter and said, "Julian, that's not fair. That's not what this is about. This isn't about ego or competition. This is about love, real love. The kind that doesn't make sense on paper, but that you can't ignore or rationalize away. And why Naomi deserves to be with someone she's passionate about, someone who makes her feel alive rather than someone who's just good for her." I turned to face him then, saw that he actually believed what he was saying, believed that he was the hero in this story, the romantic lead, who had saved the beautiful girl from a loveless marriage to his boring older brother. And something inside me snapped, something that had been holding back years of resentment and frustration, and the knowledge that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I would never be the Carter son that everyone really wanted. "Tell me, Eli," I said, and my voice was dangerously quiet. "How did you find out about my meetings with Evelyn? Because that's really why you're here, isn't it? Not to apologize for stealing my fiancé, but to make sure I'm not getting too close to Naomi's mother. To make sure I'm not finding comfort with someone who might actually see value in what you consider my boring, dependable nature." Eli's expression changed, then shifted from false remorse to something sharper, more calculating, and he said, "So it's true, you are seeing her. I couldn't believe it when someone told me they'd seen you walking together in Regent's Park, looking very cozy for two people who barely know each other, and I thought surely Julian wouldn't be that pathetic, wouldn't stoop to trying to seduce his ex-fiancée's mother out of some twisted desire for revenge seduction." I repeated and felt my hands clench into fists. "Revenge? Is that really what you think this is about? Do you really believe I'm that small, that petty, that I would use another person's feelings to get back at you and Naomi for humiliating me?" And I stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The recognition that maybe he had pushed too far this time, "Aren't you?" he said, but his voice was less certain now, less confident. "I mean, what else could it be, Julian? She's 20 years older than you. She's Naomi's mother, for Christ's sake. There's no way this is about genuine feeling. There's no way you're actually interested in her for herself, rather than as a way to hurt us." And as he spoke, I saw everything I had always hated about my brother: his inability to imagine that anyone could want something for reasons that had nothing to do with him, his assumption that everyone else was as manipulative and self-serving as he was. I hit him then, not hard enough to do real damage, but hard enough to split his lip and send him stumbling backward into the newspaper stand, and the coffee shop went quiet as everyone turned to stare at us, and I felt a moment of savage satisfaction at the shock on Eli's face, the recognition that his older brother was not as controlled as everyone assumed. "Don't," I said, and my voice was shaking with rage. "Don't you dare reduce what I feel for Evelyn to some petty revenge scheme. Don't you dare assume that because you're incapable of genuine emotion, everyone else must be as shallow and calculating as you are." And I stepped toward him again. He actually flinched, which gave me another jolt of satisfaction. "Julian, what the hell is wrong with you?" And I turned to see Naomi standing in the doorway of the coffee shop, staring at us with horror and disappointment, and she moved quickly too. Eli sighed to examine his bleeding lip, and the way she touched him so tenderly, so possessively, made something twist in my chest, but not with jealousy, with relief that I was finally free of the illusion that she had ever really loved me. "What's wrong with me?" I said, and laughed, and it sounded harsh even to my own ears. "What's wrong with me is that I'm finally seeing, clearly, finally understanding that you never cared about me at all, that I was just a placeholder until something better came along. And now you want to make sure I don't find happiness anywhere else, because that might force you to acknowledge that you threw away something valuable for the sake of a pretty face and easy charm." Naomi's eyes flashed with anger, and she said, "You're being cruel, Julian, and petty, and this obsession with my mother is disturbing and inappropriate, and you need to stop before you embarrass yourself even more than you already have." And I realized that this was how she saw it, how she would always see it, that my feelings for Evelyn were somehow a reflection on her, a pathetic attempt to stay connected to her rather than a genuine connection with an extraordinary woman. I said, and felt something settle into place inside me, some decision that had been building for days. "You're right, this is inappropriate and disturbing, and I should stop, but not for the reasons you think. I should stop because I deserve better than this, than both of you, than a family that has never valued me for who I am, rather than who they wanted me to be, and a woman who was never brave enough to be honest about her feelings. Till it was too late to do it with any grace, I turned and walked toward the door, and Eli called after me, "Julian, don't be stupid. You're throwing away your family over some middle-aged woman who's probably just using you to make herself young again." And I paused at the door and looked back at both of them, Eli with his bloodied lip and his perfect hair, and his complete inability to understand that other people had feelings that mattered, and Naomi with her beautiful face and her artistic soul and her talent for making every situation about her own emotional journey. "Goodbye, Eli." I said, "Goodbye, Naomi. I hope you'll be very happy together, and I hope you'll forgive me if I don't send a wedding gift." And then I walked out into the London morning and felt lighter than I had in years, because I was finally done trying to Earn love from people who were incapable of giving it and ready to find out what it felt like to be chosen by someone who saw me clearly and wanted me anyway. After the confrontation with Eli and Naomi, I drove north without any real destination in mind, just following the motorway until London's sprawl gave way to rolling hills and stone walls and the kind of countryside that made you remember there was a world beyond scandal and family drama and social expectations. And somewhere around the Lake District, I remembered that Evelyn had mentioned a cottage she sometimes borrowed from a friend, a place where she went when city life became too much to bear, and without really thinking about it, I found myself turning off the main road and following her directions from memory. The cottage was exactly what she had described, small and weathered with climbing roses that had gone dormant for winter, and windows that looked out over a valley dotted with sheep and the kind of silence that made you realize how much noise you carried around in your head without noticing. And I sat in my car for a long time just breathing and feeling something unknot in my chest that had been tight for so long I had forgotten it was there. I had been there for almost 24 hours walking the hills and trying to process everything that had happened when I heard a car coming up the narrow lane, and when I looked out the window I saw Evelyn's silver BMW pulling into the drive, and my heart did something complicated because I hadn't told anyone where I was going, but somehow she had known somehow. She had found me, and when she got out of the car carrying a bag of groceries and wearing jeans and a fisherman's sweater that made her look nothing like the elegant society woman I had first met, I felt something shift inside me, some recognition that this was what I had been looking for all along. "I had a feeling you might be here," she said when I opened the door, and her smile was soft and a little uncertain. "And I thought you might be living on tea and whatever was left in the cupboards from the last person who stayed here." And she was right. I had been surviving on stale biscuits and instant coffee because I hadn't wanted to leave the cottage, hadn't wanted to risk breaking whatever spell had settled over me in this place. We cooked dinner together, simple food that tasted better than any restaurant meal I had ever eaten, and talked about everything and nothing the way people do when they're not performing for anyone, when they're just being themselves. And I learned that she had studied art history before she married Richard, that she still read poetry in French, that she had once wanted to travel to Morocco, but had never found the courage, and with each small revelation, I felt myself falling deeper into something that had no name, but felt like coming home after dinner. We walked along the footpath that wound through the valley, and she pointed out constellations I had never learned to recognize, and told me stories about the local folklore, about stone circles and ancient boundaries, and the way the landscape held memory. And when I took out my phone to capture a picture of her silhouetted against the evening sky, she laughed and said I was being ridiculous, but she didn't move away, and in the photo, her expression is unguarded and luminous, and every time I look at it I remember exactly how I felt in that moment back at the cottage. We built a fire in the stone fireplace and sat on the worn sofa with glasses of wine and watched the flames dance and cast shadows on the walls, and slowly the conversation grew quieter, more intimate, until we were talking about the things that had shaped us, the losses and disappointments that had made us who we were. And when she told me about the miscarriages she had suffered before Naomi was born, about the years of trying and hoping and grieving in silence, I reached for her hand without thinking. "Julian," she said, and my name sounded different in the firelight, warmer, more weighted with possibility. "I need you to understand that this, whatever this is between us, it's not something I planned or expected, and I'm not sure I know how to navigate it, how to be in this situation with grace or wisdom." And I could see the conflict in her eyes, the war between desire and propriety, between what she wanted and what she thought she should want. "I don't need you to have all the answers," I said, and shifted closer to her on the sofa, close enough to see the way the firelight caught in her hair, close enough to smell her perfume mixed with wood smoke. "I just need you to tell me if this feels real to you, if what's happening between us is something you want to explore, or if I'm reading signals that aren't there." She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her making some internal decision, some choice between safety and risk, between the life she had always lived and the possibility of something different. And then she reached up and touched my face with her fingertips and said, "It feels real, Julian. It feels more real than anything has felt in a very long time, and that terrifies me because I don't know what happens next. I don't know how we navigate the world's judgment or our family's disapproval or the fact that loving you will complicate everything. And don't think about any of that, I said and leaned into her touch. Don't think about tomorrow or next week or what anyone else will say. Just think about this moment and whether you want to be here with me. And she smiled then, the first completely unguarded smile I had ever seen from her, and said, I want to be here with you more than I've wanted anything in years. When she kissed me, it was soft and tentative at first, as if she was giving both of us the chance to change our minds, but when I kissed her back with all the longing I had been carrying since that first night in the garden, she melted against me, and the kiss deepened, became something hungry and desperate and full of all the words we hadn't yet found the courage to say. And when we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and she rested her forehead against mine and whispered, What are we doing, Julian? What are we becoming? And I said, I don't know, but whatever it is, I don't want to stop. We stayed at the cottage for 3 more days, living in a bubble of quiet intimacy that felt separate from the real world, and I began to understand what people meant when they talked about being drunk on love, because everything felt heightened, more vivid, more meaningful, and even simple. Things like making coffee in the morning or reading by the fire took on an almost sacred quality when shared with someone who saw you completely and chose you anyway. But eventually reality intruded in the form of increasingly frantic voicemails from Lena and my assistant, and finally Evelyn's phone ringing with a call from Richard that she answered with obvious reluctance. I could hear his voice through the phone, sharp and angry even from across the room, and watched Evelyn's face grow pale as she listened to whatever he was saying, and when she finally hung up, she looked at me with an expression that was part apology, part determination, and said, We've been seen. Someone took a photo of us walking together, and it's made its way to the gossip columnists, and Richard is furious and demanding that I come home immediately to discuss damage control. The drive back to London felt like descending from some elevated place back into the mess and complication of ordinary life, and by the time we reached the city, the story had already broken in the evening papers, with headlines that ranged from mildly salacious to outright cruel. And my phone was buzzing constantly with calls from reporters and friends and family members who wanted explanations or statements or simply to express their shock and disapproval. Mother arrived at my flat within an hour of my return, her face set in lines of barely controlled fury, and she didn't even wait for me to invite her in before she began her assault. Julian, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this stops now. Do you understand me? This ridiculous infatuation with that woman is destroying our family's reputation and making us all look like fools, and I will not stand by. Watch you throw away everything we've built for the sake of some midlife crisis. I'm 32, Mother, I said with more calm than I felt. Hardly midlife, and what Evelyn and I have is not an infatuation, it's not a crisis, it's the first genuine connection I've felt with another person in years, and I'm not going to apologize for that or pretend. It doesn't matter because it makes you uncomfortable. But Mother was just getting started, and she paced around my sitting room like a caged animal, cataloging all the ways this relationship would damage our business prospects, our social standing, our family's carefully cultivated image, and with each word, I felt more certain that I was making the right choice, because the alternative was returning to a life where love was secondary to appearances, where personal happiness was sacrificed on the altar of other people's expectations. Meanwhile, across London, Evelyn was having her own confrontation with Richard, who had summoned her to his chambers for what he undoubtedly saw as a necessary intervention. And when she called me later that evening, her voice was steady, but I could hear the cost of the conversation in the slight tremor underneath her composure. He's threatened to make things very difficult for me financially if I don't end this immediately, she said, and Naomi came to see me this afternoon and accused me of betraying her, of stealing her spotlight, of being pathetic and desperate, and trying to recapture my youth through you, and I felt rage bloom in my chest at the idea of anyone talking to her that way, especially her own daughter, who had caused all of this through her own selfishness. "What did you tell them?" I asked, and she was quiet for a moment before she said, "I told them that for the first time in my adult life, I'm making a choice based on what I want rather than what's expected of me, and that I'm not going to apologize for finding happiness. Even if it comes in a form they don't approve of." The next few days brought a deluge of attention from the press and society gossips, who seemed to find our relationship endlessly fascinating in the worst possible way, and I was subjected to speculation about my motives, my mental state, my fitness for running the family business, while Evelyn faced even worse treatment, with commentators questioning her morals, her mothering her very sanity for becoming involved with someone so much younger. But through it all, Lena remained steadfast in her support, appearing on a morning talk show to defend our relationship and calling out the hypocrisy of a society that celebrated youth and beauty in women while condemning them for seeking it. And her words carried weight because she was known for her intelligence and integrity, and because she had no personal stake in defending us beyond loyalty and friendship. "Julian Carter is one of the most decent, honorable men I know," she said to the television cameras. "And if he has found love with someone who appreciates those qualities, then I'm happy for him regardless of what the gossip columnists might think about it." Watching her defend us so eloquently and fearlessly made me grateful all over again for her friendship, and reminded me that not everyone in our circle was as shallow and judgmental as they seemed. Evelyn and I made the decision not to respond to the media attention, not to justify or explain our relationship to people who had already made up their minds about us, and there was something liberating about that choice, about refusing to play the game of public opinion, and instead simply living our truth, regardless of who approved or disapproved. The dinner was Richard's idea, a family summit, he called it, as if our personal lives were international disputes, requiring diplomatic intervention, and he insisted that all parties be present at his Belgravia townhouse for what he termed a frank discussion about the situation and its resolution, and I knew it was a trap. But Evelyn said she was tired of running, tired of hiding. And if we were going to be together, then we needed to face this head-on with dignity and honesty. At the dining room at the Bellamy house had always intimidated me with its heavy mahogany furniture and portraits of stern-faced ancestors, but that evening it felt like a courtroom with Richard presiding from the head of the table in his judge's robes of moral authority, while Mother sat rigidly upright in her chair, radiating disapproval, and Naomi hunched in her seat, looking young and miserable, and confused about how everything had spiraled so far beyond her control. "This situation has gone far enough," Richard began without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "And it's time for reasonable people to acknowledge that what's happening here is destructive to everyone involved and needs to end before any more damage is done to our families and our reputations." He looked directly at Evelyn as he spoke, and I saw her spine straighten in response to his tone, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance. I was beginning to recognize and love, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "I'm curious, Richard, about your definition of reasonable, because from where I sit, it seems reasonable to pursue happiness with someone who treats me with respect and affection rather than continuing to live in a marriage that died years ago. You're being selfish, Evelyn," Richard replied, and his mask of judicial calm was beginning to slip. "You're thinking only of your own desires without considering the impact on our daughter, on our standing in the community, on everything we've built together. Over the past 25 years, everything we've built," Evelyn repeated, and there was something dangerous in her voice now. "You mean the facade we've maintained, the performance of a happy marriage? You've carried on affairs with your clerk and your colleague's wife and anyone else who caught your fancy, while I played the dutiful political wife and pretended not to notice." The silence that followed was deafening, and I saw Naomi's face go white with shock, and Mother's eyes widen with something that might have been recognition or simply surprise that someone had finally called Richard on his hypocrisy. And when Richard tried to speak, Evelyn held up her hand and continued, "I spent decades making myself smaller, quieter, more convenient, so that you could pursue your ambitions and your pleasures without interference, and I convinced myself that was love, that sacrifice and silence were what marriage required. But Julian sees me, Julian chooses me not because I'm useful or convenient, but because of who I am, and I'm not going to give that up to preserve your comfort or your reputation. This is ridiculous. Eli's voice cut through the tension, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway looking disheveled and angry. Julian, you're making a fool of yourself and embarrassing all of us over some desperate attempt to get back at Naomi and me. For following our hearts instead of some outdated notion of family loyalty following your hearts, I said, and stood up slowly, feeling years of resentment and frustration crystallize into something sharp and focused. Is that what you call it? When you manipulate someone's emotions, when you weaponize their feelings, when you take what you want, without regard for the damage you cause, because that's what you've always done, Eli. That's who you've always been. Someone who believes that wanting something gives you the right to take it. At least I'm honest about what I want. Eli shot back, at least I don't hide behind duty and responsibility. And all the other excuses you use to avoid actually living your life, you want to talk about honesty, I said, and felt something break open inside me, some dam that had been holding back decades of anger. Let's be honest about what this is really about. You can't stand that. I found something real with someone who sees value in qualities you've always dismissed as weakness. Can't stand that for once in our lives. I'm not the one left behind, the one settling for what's left after you've taken what you wanted. Naomi was crying now, silent tears that tracked down her cheeks as she looked back and forth between us, and finally she spoke in a voice so small I could barely hear it. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted to follow my heart. The way people do in stories, but real life isn't like stories. Is it real life is messier, and people get hurt, and I don't think I understood what love really was until I watched you with my mother and saw what it looks like when someone chooses you completely. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and his face was red with anger and embarrassment. And when he spoke, his voice was sharp with authority. Evelyn, this ends now. Do you understand me? This relationship with Julian ends tonight, or I will make sure you regret it financially, socially, in every way that matters. But instead of cowering or arguing, Evelyn simply reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that was both intimate and defiant. And she looked directly at her husband and said, Richard, I want a divorce. I want my freedom, and I want the chance to build a life with someone who actually loves me. And if you want to fight me on this, then we'll fight, but I'm not backing down. The room erupted then, with Richard shouting about reputation and responsibility, and Mother demanding that I come to my senses, and Eli trying to insert himself into the conversation as if his opinion mattered. But through it all, Evelyn and I sat there, holding hands across that polished mahogany table, and realized that this was what courage looked like. This was what it meant to choose love over convenience, or truth over comfort. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly proud of who I was becoming. 6 months later, I woke up in a house that belonged to both of us, to neither of us, to the life we had built together from the wreckage of everything we thought we knew about love. And I lay there for a moment, listening to Evelyn humming in the kitchen downstairs and marveling at how something that had felt so impossible, so fraught with complication and social catastrophe, had settled into something as natural and necessary as breathing. And when I went downstairs in my pajamas and bare feet, I found her making coffee in the yellow sundress I had bought her the week before. When we went antiquing in the Cotswolds, and she looked up at me with that smile that still made my heart do complicated things and said good morning, as if we had been doing this for decades instead of months. The house in Richmond wasn't grand or impressive the way the homes we had grown up in were, but it was ours in a way that those imposing family estates had never been ours to choose, ours to fill with books and art and the accumulation of shared memories. And when people asked why we had chosen something so modest when we could clearly afford more, I never knew how to explain that we were building something different, something that had nothing to do with status or appearance and everything to do with creating a space where we could be completely ourselves without performing for anyone. Today was special, though, because it was exactly 6 months since that disastrous engagement party that had ended one life and begun another, and Lena had suggested we mark the occasion with a small gathering of the people who had supported us through the worst of the social ostracism and family drama, and who had celebrated with us as we found our footing as a couple who defied every conventional expectation about how love was supposed to work. and I had been nervous about the idea at first because it felt too much like another engagement party, another public declaration that might tempt fate, but Evelyn had convinced me that we deserved to celebrate what we had built, to acknowledge that we had not only survived the storm but had emerged stronger and more certain of what we meant to each other. The guest list was small by design, just 12 people who had proven themselves to be genuine friends, rather than social acquaintances who stayed in our lives because they enjoyed the drama or the novelty of our unconventional relationship. And as I helped Evelyn arrange flowers from our garden, I thought about how different this felt from the elaborate preparations for that other party. How much more meaningful it was to celebrate love that had been tested and chosen repeatedly, rather than love that existed primarily on paper in the form of family alliances and social expectations. Lena arrived first because she always arrived first, carrying a bottle of champagne that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month, and wearing a dress that managed to be both elegant and slightly rebellious in that way. She had perfected since becoming our most vocal public defender, and when she hugged me, she whispered, "Look at you, Julian. You look like someone who's actually living his life instead of just going through the motions." And I realized she was right, that somewhere in the past 6 months, I had stopped feeling like I was waiting for my real life to begin, and had started inhabiting it fully. Other guests trickled in over the next hour. James from university, who had flown in from Edinburgh specifically for this. Sarah, my colleague, who had weathered the gossip at work and continued to treat me exactly the same as always. Marcus and David, the couple who lived next door and who had welcomed us to the neighborhood without a single raise eyebrow about our age difference or unconventional beginning. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, Evelyn's therapist, who had become a friend and supporter, though she maintained careful professional boundaries. Helen, the woman who ran the bookshop where Evelyn and I had started volunteering together on weekends. And Tom, a photographer whose quiet acceptance of our relationship had helped other people in our social circle find the courage to do the same. Watching them interact with each other and with us, I was struck by how different this gathering felt from the social events I had attended for most of my adult life. There was no undercurrent of competition or judgment. No careful calculation of who was wearing what, or who was succeeding or failing in their careers or marriages. Just genuine warmth and the kind of conversation that happened when people felt safe to be honest about their lives, their struggles, their hopes, and I realized that this was what community was supposed to feel like, this collection of people who had chosen to stand with us when it would have been easier to distance themselves. We ate simply food that Evelyn and I had prepared together, rather than hiring caterers, and we sat around our dining table that seated 8 comfortably, and for more with some creative chair arrangements, and the conversation flowed easily from books to travel to politics to the kind of personal stories that people share when they trust each other. And I found myself thinking about all the dinner parties I had attended over the years where the conversation had been carefully curated to avoid anything too personal or controversial, and how much energy we'd all wasted on being polite instead of being real. As the afternoon turned to evening and the light outside grew golden and soft, Lena stood up and tapped her champagne glass with her fork in the room. It grew quiet, and she looked around the table with that fierce expression she got when she was about to say something important, and she said, "I want to make a toast, but not to Julian and Evelyn specifically, although they're certainly worth toasting, but to the idea that love doesn't require anyone's permission except the people doing the loving." She paused and looked directly at us and continued, 6 months ago, these two people made a choice that shocked everyone who thought they knew what love was supposed to look like.
Ow.
And they were criticized and gossiped about and told in 100 different ways that what they felt couldn't be real, couldn't last, couldn't possibly be worth the social cost. But they chose each other anyway, and they kept choosing each other even when it was difficult, even when it was inconvenient, even when people they cared about turned away from them. The room was completely silent now, and I felt Evelyn's hand find mine under the table and squeeze gently, and Lena raised her glass and said, "So here's to Julian and Evelyn, for showing the rest of us what it looks like to be brave enough to choose love over comfort, to choose truth over convenience, and to choose each other every single day, regardless of what anyone else thinks about it." Everyone raised their glasses, and the sound of crystal touching crystal filled the room. But more than that, there was something in the air, something that felt like recognition and approval, and the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return, just celebrates the happiness of people it cares about. And as I looked around the table at these faces that had become dear to me, I felt a gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. After dinner, we moved outside to the garden where we had strung lights in the trees and set up a small speaker for music, and as couples began to dance on the patch of lawn we had designated as our dance floor, I found myself standing slightly apart, watching Evelyn talk to Dr. Hartwell about a book they had both read and marveling at the way she moved through the world now with a confidence and ease that had been missing during those early conversations when she still carried the weight of other people's expectations. Like a heavy coat she couldn't take off, she looks happy, Helen said, coming to stand beside me and following my gaze different than when I first met her, more herself, if that makes sense. It did make sense. Because I had watched Evelyn shed layers of protective armor over the past months, had seen her become more playful, more spontaneous, more willing to express opinions that might not be popular or politically correct, and the woman dancing barefoot in our garden bore only a passing resemblance to the perfectly composed political wife who had approached me in that hotel garden 6 months ago as the evening wound down and our guests began to leave with warm hugs and promises to get together again soon. I felt that bittersweet feeling that comes at the end of perfect days when you want to hold on to every moment but also feel grateful that such moments exist at all. And when the last car pulled out of our drive and Evelyn and I were alone in our house with the detritus of celebration scattered around us, I felt a peace that was deeper than contentment, something that approached joy. We worked together to clear the dishes and put away the extra chairs, moving with the easy choreography of people who had learned each other's rhythms and preferences. And when Evelyn discovered that someone had left music playing softly in the kitchen, she turned to me with a mischievous smile and held out her hand and said, "Dance with me, Julian. Dance with me in our kitchen, where no one can see us, where we don't have to worry about what anyone thinks." I took her hand and pulled her close, and we swayed together to music that was probably too slow for dancing, but perfect for holding each other, and I buried my face in her hair and breathed in the scent of her perfume mixed with garden air and the faint smell of wood smoke from the fireplace, and I thought about how many times I had imagined this moment during those early weeks when everything felt precarious and uncertain. When I couldn't quite believe that someone like her would choose someone like me. "Evelyn," I said, and she lifted her head to look at me, and in the soft light from the pendant lamp over our kitchen island, she looked exactly like the woman I had fallen in love with, but also somehow more herself, more complete. "I need to tell you something. I need to read you something I wrote but never sent." She tilted her head with curiosity, and I led her to the kitchen table where I had hidden an envelope in the drawer where we kept takeaway menus and batteries and other miscellaneous necessities of domestic life, and I pulled out a letter I had written during those first terrible days after the engagement party when I thought I would never see her again, except in passing at social events, where we would be polite and distant and pretend that something profound hadn't passed between us. "I wrote this the week after everything happened," I said, and my voice was rougher than I intended, when I thought what we had shared was just a moment of mutual comfort that would fade once the shock wore off. "And you went back to your real life, and I went back to mine, and I never sent it because I thought it would be presumptuous, inappropriate, but I kept it because it was the first time I'd ever been completely honest about how I felt about anything." I unfolded the letter, and the paper was soft from handling, and I could see my own handwriting shaky with emotion and exhaustion, and I began to read. "Dear Evelyn, I know I have no right to write to you like this, no right to burden you with my feelings when you have your own. It's a complicated situation to navigate, but I can't stop thinking about our conversation in the garden, about the way you looked at me as if you saw something worth seeing." My voice caught slightly, and Evelyn reached out to touch my arm encouragingly, and I continued, "I have spent my entire life feeling invisible, not because people didn't see me, but because they saw only what they expected to see: the dutiful son, the reliable colleague, the suitable husband, and I had resigned myself to being loved for my usefulness rather than my essence, until you sat beside me in that garden and spoke to me as if I were a person rather than a role." I looked up at her and saw tears in her eyes, but she gestured for me to continue, and I read, "I know this is impossible. I know all the reasons why we can't. explore what began that night. But I need you to know that in those few minutes when you really saw me, when you chose to comfort me instead of avoiding the awkwardness, I felt more alive, more myself than I had in years. And if nothing else comes of this disaster, at least, I know now what it feels like to be chosen for the right reasons. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the table, and Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Julian, do you know what I thought that night when I saw you standing alone in the garden? Do you know what made me decide to approach you instead of leaving you to your privacy?" I shook my head, and she took my hands in both of hers and said, "I thought, here is a man who has been hurt, but who isn't angry, who has been betrayed, but who isn't bitter, who has lost something important, but who isn't breaking down or lashing out." And I wanted to know what kind of person responds to pain with such dignity, and when I started talking to you, I realized that you were everything I had always hoped existed in the world, but had never found the kindness without weakness, the strength without hardness, the depth without pretension. She stood up and moved to stand in front of me, and placed her hands on either side of my face and said, "You wrote that letter because you thought I had seen you, but Julian, I need you to understand that you saw me too. You saw past the performance, past the role I had been playing for so long, had forgotten who I was underneath it, and you looked at me and saw a woman worth knowing, worth choosing, worth loving, and that changed everything for me." We stood there in our kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life we had built together, and I realized that this was what love looked like, not the dramatic declarations and grand gestures that movies and novels had led me to expect, but this quiet recognition, this daily choice to see and be seen, to know and be known completely. And I said, "Are you still sure about this, about choosing me, about building a life that doesn't look like anything either of us expected?" And she smiled, that smile that had become as necessary to me as air, and said, "Every single day, Julian, every single day I wake up and choose you and this life we're creating together, and I choose it not because it's easy or convenient or socially acceptable, but because it's real, because it's ours, because when I'm with you, I remember who I was always meant to be." We danced then in our kitchen with the dishes still in the sink and the lights still strung in the garden and the memory of our friends, laughter still echoing in the corners of our house. And I thought about how strange life was, how the worst thing that had ever happened to me had led directly to the best thing, and how sometimes what looks like an ending is actually just the beginning of a story you never knew you were brave enough to write. Outside, the night was soft and full of possibility, and inside our house was warm with the accumulated comfort of months of shared meals and quiet conversations and small acts of love. And as I held Evelyn close and felt the steady rhythm of her breathing against my chest, I knew with absolute certainty that I had finally found what I had been looking for all my life, without even knowing. I was looking for it, the rare and precious gift of being completely known and choosing each other anyway every day for the rest of our lives. When we finally turned off the music and the lights and climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I felt that particular contentment that comes from having lived a perfect day, from having been surrounded by people who loved us for who we were rather than who they wanted us to be. And as we settled into sleep in the bed we had chosen together in the house that belonged to both of us, I thought about how different this felt from every other relationship I had ever had, how peaceful and right and sustainable this love was. And in the morning when I woke up and saw Evelyn's face on the pillow beside mine, still beautiful, even with her hair messed and her makeup gone, I would choose her again, just as she would choose me, and we would make coffee together and read the newspaper and plan our day and continue building this quiet, extraordinary love that had taught us both what it meant to be truly seen, truly chosen, truly home. And I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever judgment or disapproval or complication the world might throw at us, we would face it together, secure in the knowledge that some things are worth every difficulty, worth every sacrifice, worth choosing again and again, until the choice becomes as natural and essential as breathing itself. The story of how I lost my fiancée and found my life began with betrayal and heartbreak, but it became something else entirely. It became the story of how love, when it's real, when it's right, it's based on seeing and being seen completely, can transform everything, can take to people who thought they knew what their lives were supposed to look like, and show them something better, something truer, something worth every risk they had to take. To find it and claim it and make it their own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. This one hit the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.